Have you paused to consider really why sometimes we feel a longing, a yearning for something beyond what this world offers? I mean, if you just live, you realize this earth's not perfect. It's got a few problems. It's got some issues, all right? And you don't even have to be very old to have figured that out. There's something that's built into humanity that tells us this world is not all there is. There's something deep down that tells us we were created for more, that there's something after this life, life after life. And this isn't just a feeling that's unique to Christians. It's actually part of who we are as humanity. It resonates across cultures throughout history. Virtually every religion that's ever been created grapples with the subject of what happens in eternity. What happens after we die? What happens after this life, whether it be heaven or something else? And the reason for that is, even humans from diverse backgrounds and traditions, that exist because we're created in the image of God, and there's an imprint of the divine etched on our very being. Genesis 1:27 tells us that when he created Adam and Eve, says, male and female, he created them in his image. And when we look into the mirror of that passage in Genesis, we don't just see ourselves, we see a reflection of God. And that tells us we're created for eternity. And this connection instills, this imago Dei instills a level of dignity and value in the human life and the human soul that pushes us to long for something more. And our relationship with God pulls us towards Him. There's a longing to know more about Him and be fulfilled in some way. We realize there's something missing. And the reality is that only heaven, where all things are made new, answers that call, because that's our ultimate home. It should be the home of all humanity, but it's only going to be the home of those who follow Christ. But there's this echo of eternity that resonates within all of us. It creates this concept of eternity in our mind. Heaven's not merely an end, it's actually the fulfillment of the realization of who we are and who we're meant to be. So we don't just have an eternal soul. Everything about us is created for eternity, and we feel that. We feel pulled by that. And humanity knows down deep there's something more than this. It's why even non-religious people have no trouble believing in some form of a spiritual world. And so I was asked a couple of weeks ago, probably about a month ago now, to sit in on a panel discussion on the topic of heaven and hell. And as I began to read and get prepared for that and take notes on that and get my thoughts together for that, I realized just how little most people understand about the biblical concepts of heaven and hell. How many misconceptions there are, just how many questions people ask about heaven and hell. Even in my own views, as I began to read and study, I realized how inconsistent and even contradictory in some areas I was. And so, considering that the death rate of humanity is 100%, I thought it would be helpful to take a few weeks and look at eternity and what happens after we die. I know we normally go through books of the Bible, but right now we finished Colossians a couple of weeks ago, so we're just going to take a few weeks and look at the doctrine of heaven. And then we're going to take Sunday and look at the doctrine of hell, because unless Christ returns, we're all going to die. I mean, it's not something we really want to think about, but it's going to happen. And so when it comes to heaven, though, let me ask you a question. I don't ask hypothetical questions all the time. It's not a hypothetical, rhetorical question. I actually want answers. Give me some feedback. When you think heaven, what do you think of? What do you have in your mind, right? Y'all aren't willing to answer because you know where I'm headed with this, right? St. Peter, right? And where is St. Peter? He's at the pearly gates, right? I mean, you got streets of gold, right? What you got, Chris? Anything about heaven? Just clouds? I hear you. No sin. There's a good one. See, that's a good one. Y'all know y'all just sang a song about heaven like 45 seconds ago, right? Joy. Joy is a good one. Well, y'all know I have no problems saying the quiet parts out loud. So here it goes. What I was taught about heaven growing up actually made me not really care if I went or not. Now, I was glad to not be going to hell, but there was nothing I heard about heaven that made me go, man, I want to go there. Most of my life, what I learned about heaven from preachers and Christian songs and culture and religious paintings made me think of heaven as something that ultimately, honestly, was just going to be incredibly boring. I mean, I'm going to float around on a cloud and sing songs for eternity? Y'all know me, I like to sing. But come on, eternity? I'm going to sit around in a big, big house with lots and lots of room and a big, big table with lots and lots of food and a big, big yard where we can play what? Really, for eternity? I like football. I'm kind of past my play football days. I love the game, but I don't know if I want to be playing for all eternity, Jeff. I just don't have that. That doesn't sound fun to me. I'm going to sit around in my mansion and do what? Wait for the next church service? Because that's what we're going to do, right? We're just going to be sitting around singing all the time. And look, I think walking on streets of gold would be really cool. But if I'm going to be honest with y'all, after about 2 weeks, I'm going to be like, done that. What else we got? Right? I mean, it's gold streets. I've seen it. I mean, isn't that the way we are? The version of heaven I've heard about most of my life tells me that everything I love about this life will no longer exist. And honestly, that kind of makes me sad. But is that actually the picture of heaven that the Bible paints? Now, I know I'm not the only one that thinks this. I'm just the only one usually probably bold enough to say it. I'm not the only one who feels this way. And honestly, I've thought for a long time that probably there was something broken in me spiritually that caused me to feel this way. But I Googled heaven. Can you pull those pics up? I Googled heaven. Here you go. Here's the first 5 pics on Google for heaven. Just scroll through them. It's all good. There's St. Peter. I don't know where Peter is. There's the gate. Keep going. Right? I could have got better quality photos, but why? It's all boring. Keep going. All right? See, there's a painting. And then you got this last one. And this one's scary. I know it's supposed to be cute, but that's scary. Right? We got a bridge going to dog heaven. What is that? Giant dogs? I like dogs, but those are big dogs. I don't know what's up with that. All right, you can get off that. Does any of that make you long to go? If you've had these same thoughts, I promise you it has nothing to do with your spirituality. If you're disappointed, it's because the version of heaven, this is not what the Bible describes. And most of what we typically hear what the Bible portrays as heaven is not boring. It's not wrong to long for something better than sitting around on clouds and walking on streets of gold and singing all the time. Even though there's going to be streets of gold, I don't know if there's going to be clouds or not, there will be some singing. In probably the most extensive book written on heaven that I'm aware of, Randy Alcorn said that what God made us to desire, and therefore what we desire if we admit it, is exactly what he promises to those who follow Jesus Christ. A resurrected life in a resurrected body with a resurrected Christ on a resurrected earth. Our desires correspond precisely to God's plans. It's not that we want something so we engage in wishful thinking that what we want exists. It's the opposite. The reason we want it is because God planned for it to exist. And as we see resurrected people living in a resurrected universe, it's our idea. So let's talk about heaven. Let's look at scriptures to try and determine what heaven will be like. We're going to spend about 3, maybe 4 sermons, probably 3 sermons on heaven. But today we're going to look at the theology of heaven. And I'm going to raise more questions than I answer. I'm very aware of that. But what we're going to do is we're going to look at theology of heaven this week. And then in a couple of weeks, we're going to look at the new heaven and the new earth. And then after that, I'm going to literally just work through Scripture and try to answer the bulk of the normal questions people have about heaven, like, will there be animals in heaven? Will we know our family and friends in heaven? What are we going to do in heaven? And those types of things. So if you've got a heaven question, actually send me an email, and if I can, I'll answer it on September 17th. But for now, let's look at the theology of heaven. The first thing we need to understand about heaven is that heaven is a place. Heaven isn't just an idea. It isn't simply a state of being. Heaven is a physical place. Now, that matters for multiple reasons, but if you just need to understand, it's a place. The stories of Ezekiel, Stephen, Paul, and actually a couple of others who saw glimpses of heaven that's reported in Scripture, what they saw was a place. And the current heaven that the Bible describes as the place where angels physically dwell is the place Satan and the angels were kicked out of, which means it has physical characteristics. And in a dozen places in the Bible, heaven is described as the dwelling place of God. And it will always be the dwelling place of God, meaning that wherever God is, that's where heaven is. And I understand God is spirit and all that. We'll look at that here pretty quickly. But in 1 Kings 8:30, it says, "Listen to the plea of your servant and your people Israel when they pray towards this place, and listen in heaven your dwelling place. When you hear, forgive." Psalm 33, the Lord looks down from heaven. He sees all the children of man. From where he sits enthroned, he looks out at all the inhabitants of the earth. Now, God is spirit, but that doesn't mean that we should look at the nature of God to determine the nature of heaven. God is eternal, but heaven is not eternal. Heaven actually was created. It was part of creation. And I'm aware that God's spirit, and I'm aware he's omnipresent, but all of those scriptures, and there are dozens of them, that talk about heaven being the dwelling place of God are not simply symbolic. We'll look at that more in depth in Revelation later, but God has chosen to have some unique part of himself in heaven. And consider this, God doesn't dwell there because he has to. God dwells there because he has chosen to. And it's important that we understand this. God is the dwelling place of God because it's going to actually affect what we do in heaven. Revelation 21, Brent read it this morning, was all over that part. Heaven is a place. But the heaven that exists at this moment in time is not where we will spend all of eternity. Right? We need to be clear about that. We need to distinguish between what heaven is now and what heaven will be in the future. And you might be asking, are they different? And the answer is yes. If you die before Christ returns, the place that you go is not the final version of heaven. The ultimate, final, completed version of heaven does not exist yet. Are y'all with me? All right. I can tell some of y'all are acting like you never heard that before. So let me explain. The heaven that we typically mean, because we can only really think about the now, and that's not a negative, it just is typically referred to as the intermediate state. It's kind of a theological term. In John 14, Jesus is explaining to the disciples that he won't be on earth forever, and this is what he says. He said, Jesus said, "In my Father's house are many rooms. If it were not so, would I have told you that I go to prepare a place for you? And if I go and prepare a place for you, I will come again and will take you to myself, that where I am, you may be also." So Christ goes to prepare a place. Goes where? He goes to heaven. He goes to the dwelling place of God in order to what? To prepare a place. For who? The saints. Which means wherever Christ went is going to change. Now, is he preparing it right now? In a sense, yes. What we know is that the final heaven that will happen after the return of Christ is different than where Christians go at this moment if you die before the return of Christ. So are there two heavens? I'm not going to say there's two heavens. I'm going to say there's now heaven and later heaven. And I don't know. I don't think we can make a definitive answer. Does heaven now disappear and get replaced? or is it all part of creation? We'll look at that a little bit more next week. But right now, the heaven that exists in the realm of angels, separate from earth, still has physical qualities. But in the future, heaven will move into, this is so important, heaven will move into the human realm. The place where God dwells will also be our home in a renewed, recreated, redeemed universe, whatever word you want to use. It's like what John saw in his vision of a new heaven and a new earth, a new Jerusalem coming down from God, and a voice declaring that God's dwelling is now with us. And so actually turn to Revelation 21. I know Brent read it this morning, but I think it might help us to look at it a little bit more closely, because one day heaven won't be up there, it will be on a renewed earth. So if you remember, all right, remember this as we read this. Chapters 19 through 22 haven't happened yet. So in Revelation 21, 1 through 5, then I saw a new heaven and new earth. For the first heaven and the first earth had passed away, and the sea was no more. I also saw the holy city, the new Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared like a bride adorned for her husband. Then I heard a loud voice from the throne, "Look, God's dwelling is with humanity, and he will live with them. They will be his peoples, and God himself will be with them and will be their God. He will wipe away every tear from their eyes. Death will be no more. Grief, crying, and pain will be no more, because the previous things have passed away." Then the one seated on the throne said, "Look," this is Jesus, "look, I am making all things new." He also said, "Write, because these words are faithful and true." All right, so think about this. The New Jerusalem, described as coming down from heaven, is headed where? It's headed to earth, the new earth. And from that point, it says it right here in verse 3. God's dwelling will be with humanity, with us here on the renewed earth. Now, some say, some think we shouldn't call the new earth heaven. I don't agree with that. If heaven is where God dwells, and then God's coming down in the New Jerusalem, and he's here in the same way he would have been in the Garden of Eden, then I think it's fine to call that heaven. In fact, I think we should call it heaven. It's clear from verse 3 that God's throne is in the New Jerusalem that's brought down to earth. So wherever God is with his people, that place should be called heaven. Anthony Hokum has said that the New Jerusalem doesn't stay far off in space, but it comes to the renewed earth. We, the redeemed, will be there in resurrected bodies. Heaven and earth, once separate, will merge. The new earth will also be heaven, since God will be there with his people. And this idea aligns perfectly with Genesis 3:8. When Adam and Eve were in the garden, God didn't pull them out of the garden up to where he was. It says God came to the garden. They communed with God in the garden. He came and walked among them in this world. And Jesus said that he and the Father would make a home to anyone who follows him. So this idea paints a picture of God's ultimate goal being to commune with us, even in a more so than he is now. And so the final heaven happens after the return of Christ. And like I keep saying, we'll look at that in depth next week. But what about right now? What about in the past? All those who were saved, regenerated in the Old and New Testament, who died before Christ has returned, where do they go when they die? This concept is called the intermediate state, which is the in-between phase from when we, what the old hymn says, shuffle off this mortal coil to when we're resurrected. So for Christians, it's an immediate transition from death into the presence of Christ. We know this from 2 Corinthians 5. And during that time, we'll experience holiness, which means no more longing flesh for sin, no more war within the flesh. Well, we will have glorification. It waits. Final glorification awaits resurrection. I think it's probably the best way to word that. So, but we will have happiness. We'll have heightened sense of conscience. We'll have knowledge of Christ in the fullness. But the intermediate state is not our final state. That's not going to happen until the return of Christ. And Paul's thoughts on this, in fact, let's look at it. Turn to 2 Corinthians 5. So let's read. Let's just start in verse 1. For we know that if our earthly tent we live in is destroyed, we have a building from God, an eternal dwelling in the heavens not made with hands. Indeed, we groan in this tent, desiring to put on our heavenly dwelling, since we are clothed. We will not be found naked. Indeed, we groan while we are in this tent, burdened as we are, because we do not want to be unclothed but clothed, so that mortality may be swallowed up by life. Now the one who prepared us for this very purpose is God, who gave us the Spirit as a down payment. And then in 6, he really kind of explains what he just said. He said, so we are always confident and know that while we are at home in the body, we are away from the Lord, for we walk by faith, not by sight. In fact, we are confident and we prefer to be away from the body and at home with the Lord. So here Paul says the ideal thing would be to be alive when Jesus returns, because that way it can save us the heartache of dying and experiencing this, what he calls naked and unclothed, which is the ripping apart of the body and the soul. I mean, he's pretty straightforward. Life on earth is good because we're serving Christ, making the most of it. But if we die, we get to go be with Jesus. But actually the ultimate would be to be around Jesus for the grand re-entrance. We get to skip the death part, and then you get your shiny new resurrected body without having to go through death. I mean, that sounds better to me. I don't know about y'all. I don't want to die. So I see why Paul wrote it the way he wrote it. But Paul is saying being in your body means you're not in the direct presence of the Lord, but once you're out of that body, you are in the presence of Christ. And I think the transition's immediate. There doesn't seem to be any waiting period, no holding pattern. And so when we die, faith turns to sight, hope turns to reality. And honestly, this doctrine is the one that's going to deal with things like soul sleep, which is the concept of that when we die, that we are actually, our souls just stay asleep until Jesus returns and we get our glorified body. And what they're trying to do is, I mean, it's a terrible doctrine, but what they're attempting to do with that doctrine is explain this kind of unknown between death now and glorification, but I think they overstate their case. Also, purgatory. This actually goes directly against the doctrine of purgatory, and so that's why this is important. But Paul seemed pretty confident here, and he says we're going to be with Jesus. We know where Jesus is. Jesus is in heaven. But then he will return to earth. He'll bring all those who've died with him. He'll fulfill the renewal of heaven and earth. So the state we're currently in is not the final state. But the one other thing we need to look at, and I think this will help us in the now and in the future as we think about heaven. This earth is a shadow of heaven. We don't tend to think that way, but I think it will help us think about heaven. Randy Alcorn's book, Richard Mouw's book on the New Jerusalem, it's a book about Isaiah and the prophecies from Isaiah, really helped me think through this. This might be an idea that messes with your mind, but I want to try to explain it in a way. What does it mean that earth is a shadow of heaven? Let's look at Hebrews. We're gonna look at multiple passages in Hebrews for this, but Hebrews 8 first. So Hebrews 8 begins telling us we have this kind of high priest who sat at the right hand of the throne of majesty in the heavens, a minister of the sanctuary and the true tabernacle that was set up by the Lord and not man. This is Jesus, who's the high priest of a heavenly tabernacle. And then look at verse 4. It talks about the earthly priest serving at a sanctuary that is a copy and shadow of what is in heaven. And then look, verse 5 talks about Moses, where Moses was told as he's setting up the tabernacle, see to it that you make everything according to the pattern shown you on the mountain. So if the earthly tabernacle is a copy of what Moses saw in heaven, doesn't it kind of make you wonder if the original heaven, I assume it's physical there as well, but that's not really my point. But This is my point. We tend to think of heaven and earth as opposites. Earth bad, heaven good. Right? Y'all tend to think that way? Well, you've been trained to think that way. The reason for that is all we know about earth is fallen earth. We know earth with sin. We don't know earth before sin. In fact, how much are we even given in Scripture about pre-sin earth? Not much. Hebrews seems to argue that the earth we know is like a bag cover version of the original hit. I think that's probably a good analogy. And then when you get to Hebrews 9, you can flip over there in verse 11. It says, Christ went through the greater, more perfect tabernacle that is not man-made, that is to say, not a part of this creation. And then jump down to verse 24. Christ did not enter a man-made sanctuary that was only a copy of the true one. He entered heaven itself. So we have this copy, this shadow, an original concept played out through multiple passages in Hebrews. And then if you look at Hebrews 12:22, the New Jerusalem began as being in the intermediate state of heaven. In verse 22, instead, you have come to Mount Zion, to the city of the living God, the heavenly Jerusalem, to myriad of angels, a festival gathering, to the assembly of the firstborn whose names have been written in heaven, to a judge who is God of all, to the spirits of righteous people made perfect, and to Jesus, the mediator of the new covenant, and to the sprinkled blood, which says better things than the blood of Abel. Now, this is describing things that exist here on earth and in heaven, but all of the descriptions of the ones in heaven are better versions. All we know are copies. And like, I think even better analogy for some of y'all might be those old copy machines where you put on a nice photo and it came out all blurry. Y'all know those? Y'all might still use some of those at work. So this means on some level that at least part of what exists here on earth exists in heaven in some form. So don't get caught up in thinking that nothing that exists here will exist in heaven. C.S. Lewis actually described this concept as comparing the beauty of heaven to earth, as comparing a diamond to a lump of coal. And here's where we usually trip up. We read through passages based on our understanding of earth, and we can only visualize them based on what we know. And one writer said we tend to reason. We tend to start with earth and reason upwards instead of the other way around, which is what the Bible actually does. We tend to think heaven takes its cues from earth, but when the Bible describes heaven as a city and a community and a culture, what we know of those things is just a shadow of the reality that they will be in heaven. So instead of trying to grasp heaven by starting with what we know on earth, let's think of heaven first and bring that down to earth and realize what we've got here are broken versions of a lot of the things that will be in heaven. Why does this matter? Well, it matters because honestly, it'll shake up how you view the world and how you view heaven. Instead of thinking of earthly experiences and relationships and all those things are strictly something that happens here, we see to start catching glimpses of how we're going to have greater versions of that in heaven. And I think I could be bold enough to say the things you love the most about earth now will be perfected versions of that in heaven. It's not just believing that we're going to a better place after we die. It's about recognizing that life and love and beauty and experience that we have now, those are shadows of what we'll experience in heaven. The source. What we know of now is perfected in heaven. I mean, doesn't that sound better? Changes the game a little bit for me. If all I can do is think of earth as a sneak peek of heaven, look, there's a lot of things about earth. In fact, Revelation 21 tells us the parts that are not going to be in heaven. right? And we get all excited about that. But I don't think we actually ever think about what's going to be there in the sense of what we can look at earth and go, oh, God's going to get rid of all these bad things. But we never actually look and say, what about all these good things? What about relationships? Right? I mean, if the church is a representation, earthly representation of heaven, we need to consider what's that going to look like in heaven. And I don't mean we're all going to sit around in church services. We won't need to. We're going to have that community that we have, the bond, the unity around Christ that we have even in church. And so, and honestly, the thing I love about this is it explains so much about the language of Christ as mediator and bridge, the source, the connection between heaven and earth. I mean, when Paul says there's one God and one mediator between God and man, the man Christ Jesus, Jesus spans the gap caused by sin and connects humanity back to God. And that gap is what's keeping us from reaching heaven. And Christ as heaven and earth, God and man, is able to bridge that gap. So again, we have both happening, heaven and earth, God and man in Jesus Christ. Worship team, y'all go ahead and come on up. One more passage. Since you're already in Hebrews, look at Hebrews 4. Hebrews 4:14. It says, therefore, since we have a great high priest who has passed through the heavens, Jesus the Son of God, let us hold fast to our confession. Let us then approach the throne of grace with confidence. It's as if this passage is saying, look, Christ has gone through the very heavens. He's the ultimate source realm, and he has a direct line to it. He's the reason we have access to the source realm, to heaven. And he's the ultimate connection between heaven and earth. And the amazing thing is while we're waiting on his return, we're waiting on the renewal of all creation, Christians who have been changed by the Holy Spirit, regenerated, born again, whatever term you want to use, renewed, redeemed, all those things right here. Now, not final, but we're experiencing a renewal right now in our souls. Now, it's not what it's going to be. That's what the word glorification explains. It's not going to be what it's going to be. It's going to be better than this. I'm going to get a body back. Now, I know what I'd like that to look like, but I don't know if I'll care when I get to heaven. Do I want hair or not? I'm actually undecided about that. I've been this way so long now, I think it'd be weird to have hair. But I don't know. We'll see what happens. We are really, in a true sense, as believers, if you're a believer, there's a real sense, and you're already experiencing renewal. So think about it. Christ comes down from heaven to earth, and he didn't just come down for a visit. He came as one of us, eating our food, feeling our pain, shedding real tears, shedding his own blood. And in doing so, he became a living bridge between the two realms. And if earth echoes heaven, then Christ is the original melody. And the truest note that resonates from heaven comes through Christ. And Paul wrote it in Colossians 1. He said, for God was pleased to have all his fullness dwell in him, that through him to reconcile everything to himself, whether things on earth or things in heaven, by making peace through his blood shed on the cross. So that's what Christ did. Reconciled us on this broken earth, his elect, his chosen, his believers, the ones he called, reconciled us to heaven, to God, the dwelling place of God. So it's more than just feel-good sentiment. I mean, knowing that this earth is a broken copy, influenced by heaven, shifts our perspective. But understanding that it was Christ that was able to bridge that gap should also shift our perspective. Christ is a key to it all. In fact, he's the whole point of the story. So heaven's not just a future destination we tap into. There's a present reality that's happening right now that's tied to Christ. And so, as we partake in communion today, that's where I want us to focus. right? We hadn't done that. We don't do that very often. But guess what? Because of the cross, you get to go to heaven. And in a sense, you get to experience some of heaven now. And so as we partake in communion today, I just want you to be thankful for that. Be thankful that this isn't all there is, and that God provided a way for us to leave the copy and go to the source.